Welcome back. This video will be my introduction to ZvZ. So assuming that maybe you're like a, I don't know, World of Warcraft player or something, or you come from some other game, you saw the Albion ad, you installed it, but you don't really know, you've heard these terms ZvZ, but you don't know what it means. That's what this video is for. And we're also going to talk about a bunch of the mechanics in the game that have sort of shaped why the fights in Albion work the way that they do. So first off, what is ZvZ? ZvZ or Z versus Z if you're British, English, or whatever, stands for Zerg versus Zerg, being of course a StarCraft reference to the faction in that game where you create like giant swarms of units to overwhelm your enemy. In Albion, we start referring to PvP battles as ZvZs pretty much once you get above 10 people. 10 to 20 is like a really small scale ZvZ. Anywhere between 40 to 100 versus 40 to 100 is like an average number. And the cap that can fit within a certain zone is somewhere between 300 and 400 people. I don't know exactly. I'm sure someone does, but it doesn't particularly matter to me. I just know that it is a lot of people. So then the question is, why ZvZ? There's a couple things. Scattered around the map, particularly in the Black Zone or the Outlands, whatever you want to call it, are various objectives. Taking these objectives typically award essentially money and or loot, as well as season points. Usually the money comes in like the form of like siphoned energy, which can be used for some things, but you can also just sell it. That's the resource they use to overcharge your gear. For most of these objectives, you technically only need like 5 people, maybe like a tank, a healer, some DPS. I think there's a couple builds out there that you could use to solo it. But the mobs, like the PvE mobs at these objectives, are really just to kind of slow you down a little bit to give another group a chance to respond. And the real like struggle to taking an objective is the enemy players that will come to defend it. And I guess as much as you would like to take these objectives as a small group, you can only take on so many enemies before you need to start recruiting your own group, and thus begins the rat race for Zerg size that I am sure I'll talk about at some point in this series. The most commonly fought over objectives are territories, castles, and outposts. And I guess more recently the faction update. That'll probably talk about that at some point by itself, or maybe it'll just crop up here and then. Second reason to fight in Albion is that it is a full loot game, which means every time that you kill someone, you get to pick up their stuff. And if you win a ZvZ fight, you know, if you have 50 people and you kill 50 of their people, then there's 50 bodies for you to pick up. You know, whenever someone dies, a portion of their gear has like a chance to turn into trash. And that's part of the economy of the game, but it still can be a shit ton of loot just from winning a fight. Or, you know, there are people, a disturbingly large amount of people, that will just show up to fights and just pick through bodies as you know, groups are fighting and try and get away with as much loot as they can. That is a part of the game as well. The last reason that I have is that fighting people in large groups is just a lot of fun. You've got a large group of people that meet up almost every day to play together. If you choose to engage in it, you can get a real sense of community with your fellow guildmates. Obviously, that'll depend on the people you're with and like the leadership of the guild. For me personally, I like getting into the strategy of it all. How you move around the map, when do you engage, trying to trick your enemy into a bad position. Other people like getting into the political aspect of it, forming alliances, negotiating deals, and whatnot. Whatever your reasoning, you should definitely be having fun while you do it. Otherwise, you should probably not do it. Alright, getting into the mechanics. First things that we're going to talk about are AoE escalation and focus fire protection. I'll be doing... What did I write here? I plan on doing deep dives into various topics related to ZvZ, but we should be able to cover the essentials within a single video. First thing you need to know are two mechanics that really define how ZvZs are played out in Albion. The first one is AoE escalation, AoE being area of effect. What this does is make it so that the more targets you hit with the spell or ability or whatever, the more damage it does. I believe it goes up to a cap. I want to say it's like 20 targets, but don't quote me on that. So the idea being that you want to hit as many people with your spells as possible to do more damage and be more likely to kill them. You can see this if you're when you're fighting, is that like if you duel someone and you hit them with a spell and then go into a ZvZ and hit multiple people with a spell, you'll see that like it does different amounts of damage. The second mechanic is focus fire protection. This makes it so that the more unique targets that do damage to you, the less damage you take. This provides some balance to being outnumbered, but mostly it allows tank characters to actually exist and survive within a ZvZ. If you didn't have this, tank characters would get deleted by even small amounts of damage. You know, like, you get hit by a single auto attack, no big deal. You know, it'd say it does 10 damage, but if 100 people auto attack you for 10 damage, you just die. You know, with focus fire protection, tanks can shrug off, you know, these auto attacks and a lot of the small spells and kind of ambient damage. And yeah, I believe that also goes up to a cap, but I'm not entirely sure. So how does this affect the strategy of the fight? The first is that in order to do the most amount of damage that you can, you want to hit large clumps of enemies. There's a couple weapons you could use that will kind of suck in enemies together and make them easier to hit, but you can also use the terrain to force your enemies to clump together. And you can also, you know, with a good eye, you can just kind of watch enemy movements, and people tend to, you know, as they're kind of milling about, they'll clump themselves, and that can be capitalized on. But so already this means that coordination is required to do good amounts of damage. You need some players to create clumps of enemies, others to stun them and lock those players in place, and then others to do the damage. Focus fire protection is sort of a weird one. It sounds like it means that you actually want fewer people hitting large groups of damage. You want fewer people hitting large groups of people to do maximum damage. Which is true, but the problem is that your smaller group of people still needs to do enough damage to actually kill people. And the focus fire protection damage reduction isn't strong enough to cancel out like adding more DPS players. So like focus fire protection will protect you from ambient damage and like small amounts of damage, but it's not going to protect you from 100 people using their E's on you. especially once you add in AoE escalation, which will kind of cancel out that focus fire protection. All right, next thing will be armor and tankiness. So, okay, so in Albion, your chest armor and your weapon are the most important pieces of equipment in terms of stats. Cloth chest pieces will give you somewhere between like 40 and 50% damage and healing increase. Leather gives 20 to 30%, and plate armors gives 0 to 10%, depending on which one. In exchange, leather and plate armors give you more armor and CC resistance. Okay, so tanks are harder to kill than leather, which are harder to kill than cloth. If you kill all the tanks, the enemy DPS won't be very effective because they won't have anyone to clump people for them, and also no one will be able to stop you from running them over. If you kill all the enemy damage, they won't be able to stop you from running them over. If you kill all the healers, it'll be much easier to run the enemy over. But the DPS and healers are much easier to kill than the tanks. However, the people wearing cloth should know that they are more vulnerable, and so they usually stand behind the tanks and sort of far away. This should be fairly obvious and common sense, but is important to especially what we're going to talk about next. So the way we make up for the fact that the clothies are usually far away is that in Albion, all of the boots, I think all of the boots, contain some sort of like movement and utility ability. We'll talk about the ones that are normally used later, but as we just mentioned, we need to be able to cover some distance because we're going to have to sprint to the enemy in order to reach their clothies so that we can clump them and drop damage. Most of the sprints have a 30-second cooldown, meaning that we can do this sprint to the back line and get to the easy targets every 30 seconds. Coincidentally, the E cooldown for most weapons used in ZvZ also have a 30-second cooldown. Alright, healing. Albion is a game with healing, and the healing is quite powerful. So one of the main things this means is that poke damage is essentially useless. In a game like League of Legends, if you hit someone with ability and you poke down their health, unless they have some sort of special healing ability or a Soraka on their team, then your poke damage will stay there. And so you can slowly whittle enemies down until they have to leave the fight to go back to base to heal. But in Albion, if you don't kill an opponent, then within 3 to 10 seconds, they'll probably be back to full health and in fighting shape. Mana is also not usually a limiting factor, so causing healers to expend mana is typically not very important. Unless the fight goes very long and they're not using their mana regen options effectively. So the other thing that this means for healing is that you sort of have a time limit to kill a clump of enemies. The big heals in this game are balanced by having a cast time as well as a delay before they activate. So you'll typically, maybe I'll put up a clip of it, but you'll see the circles on the ground and then they kind of fill up and then they'll pop at the end of that. So if your enemy is able to place a heal underneath the clump of enemies that you created, chances are the group isn't going to die. So you want to kill the clump before it can be healed. Healing reduction weapons exist, but in my opinion, with the current balance of things, you are better off just bringing another pure damage dealer and killing the clump faster than you are adding focus fire protection in order to reduce their healing taken. Because typically the healing reduction weapons also don't do that, like they're balanced by not doing as much damage. Also, you could just bring a tank weapon and stun the enemy healers, which makes them do 0 healing. Okay, so putting this all together, we want to hit clumps of enemies for maximum damage. We need enough damage to kill the group, and it needs to happen quickly. We want to hit the enemies wearing cloth, since they are easier to kill, and who are usually towards the back of the enemy group. Most sprints have a 30-second cooldown. Most E abilities have a 30-second cooldown. So what this results in is every 30 seconds, the group engages together, which usually looks like they'll pop their kind of power-up abilities and sprint towards the enemy, and then they'll try to clump them together and blow them up. Afterwards, they'll generally pull back in an attempt to create distance between them and their enemy, because now their boots and their E's are on a 30-second cooldown, and possibly some of their other abilities, and so they'll want to create as much distance as they can between them and their enemy. Since everyone needs to act together in this manner, Zergs usually have a shot caller who will kind of give countdowns as well as dictate directions. While everyone plays their own character, the shot caller sort of plays the Zerg. And I think that covers it.